Good evening and welcome. We thank you all for being here tonight for this very important and timely discussion. From the time of Dickinson College's founding, this campus has been a place to gather and discuss the topics of the day, no matter how light or heavy. Dickinson today is no different. It is essential for our community to continue to come together, to share and to learn from each other and from scholars outside of the college. Tonight, I am honored to introduce Alyza Lewin, who has spent the day meeting and talking with students and faculty, and I'm particularly thrilled that she is with us this evening to deliver a keynote address titled Erasive Antisemitism, Challenging the Denial of Jewish History and Identity. Alyza is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, a nonprofit organization established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and to promote justice for all. I assume many of you know who Louis Brandeis was. Louis Brandeis, of course, was an eminent Supreme Court justice who served on the High Court for several decades. There may have been folks on the Supreme Court who were as smart as Louis Brandeis, but none were smarter, none were better as a justice on the court. I would venture to say that he is one of the most remarkable jurists in the history of our country, and to work at a center that is named after the great Justice Brandeis is impressive to me. Louis Brandeis was a role model for me during my time on the bench, although I could never approach his intellect or his scholarly writing. A formidable justice, and Alyza, your work is emblematic of Louis Brandeis and his great career. Focused on the important work of research, education, and legal advocacy to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism on college campuses and in the workplace, the Brandeis Center empowers students by educating them on their legal rights and educating administrators and employers on best practices to combat racism and anti-Semitism. I should note that we recently learned that Alyza has been invited to testify on Wednesday morning at the Senate Judiciary Committee in a session that is being held on the topic of anti-Semitism. Alyza is also co-founder and partner of the law firm Lewin & Lewin, where she specializes in litigation, mediation, and government relations. Her experience includes criminal defense, civil litigation, and anti-discrimination matters. Alyza received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University and a JD from New York University School of Law. She's a member of the Bars of New York and the District of Columbia. She also received training as a mediator by the American Arbitration Association and the Center for Dispute Settlement. Having Alyza with us tonight is a wonderful full-circle moment. Her father, Nathan Lewin, also a renowned attorney and a partner in Lewin & Lewin, spoke at Dickinson in 2000 on the topic of civil rights, religion, and the law. After her remarks, Alyza will be joined by Professor Andrea Lieber for some clarifying questions, followed by questions from the audience. Alyza, thank you for joining us at Dickinson and for sharing your insights into this entirely relevant topic. Please welcome her.
Thank you, President Jones, Vice President Champion, Vice President Boston, Provost Kramer, and Professor Lieber. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. It's really a true honor and a pleasure to be here. 4 years after Dr. Benjamin Rush founded Dickinson College, he attended a Jewish wedding. It was the wedding of Rachel Phillips to Michael Levy, and it was held in Philadelphia in June 1787. We know about this wedding because Benjamin Rush, one of America's founding fathers and a signatory to the Declaration of Independence, was so enamored with the Jewish event that he described it in great detail in a letter to his wife. His letter is the earliest description we have of a Jewish wedding in America. Rush told his wife that he, quote, accepted the invitation to the wedding with great pleasure, for you know I love to be in the way of adding to my stock of ideas upon all subjects, close quote. Rush's curiosity and positive enthusiasm are evident throughout his letter, as he reports, quote, at 1 o'clock, the company, consisting of 30 or 40 men, assembled in Mr. Phillips' common parlor, which was accommodated with benches for the purpose. The ceremony began with prayers in the Hebrew language, which were chanted by an old rabbi, and in which he was followed by the whole company, close quote. Rush reports that he, quote, did not understand a word except now and then an amen or a hallelujah, close quote. And he reports that the prayer service lasted about 20 minutes. The wedding took place following that brief prayer service, which was likely the daily afternoon mincha prayer service, which has been recited by Jews for centuries and is still recited by Jews today. In his letter, Rush described many details of the event, including the chuppah, the Jewish marriage canopy, under which the ceremony took place. He described it and said, quote, a beautiful canopy composed of white and red silk in the middle of the floor, supported by 4 young men by means of 4 poles, who put on white gloves for the purpose, close quote. He described the bride's veil, which he said covered her face and reached halfway down her body. And he described the entire ceremony, including the reading of the ketubah, the marriage contract, the blessings that were said over the wine, and how at the end, the groom broke a glass, which was followed by, quote, a general shout of joy, close quote. What Rush witnessed that day were Jews in America celebrating a life cycle event with customs, prayers, and traditions that for centuries have connected Jews around the globe to one another and to their ancestral heritage. These customs, prayers, and traditions, which are still followed today, highlight that the Jews share more than a common faith. As a people, Jews also share a history and a heritage linked to the land of Israel. Let's start where Rush began, with the afternoon mincha prayer that the wedding guests recited that day. Included in the liturgy for that service is a prayer recognizing that Jews were historically exiled from their ancestral homeland and dispersed around the globe. The prayer is for the ingathering of the exiles, and it includes the words, Baruch atah Hashem mekabetz nidchei amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, Lord, who gathers the dispersed of his people, Israel. The mincha service also includes a prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Baruch atah Hashem bonei Yerushalayim. Blessed are you, Lord, who builds Jerusalem. And it also includes a prayer for the return of God's presence to Zion. Zion is another name for Jerusalem. V'techazena einenu b'shuvcha l'tzion berachamim. And may our eyes witness your return to Zion in compassion. Baruch atah Hashem hamachzir shchinato l'tzion. Blessed are you, Lord, who restores his presence to Zion. In addition to the prayers that were said that day, the Jewish wedding customs connected that American bride and groom to their Jewish ancestral roots. For example, the marriage canopy, the chuppah, representing the home that the couple would build, is open on all 4 sides to recall the tent of the patriarch Abraham, known for his hospitality. Similarly, the veil the bride wore is to recall the veil worn by the biblical matriarch, Leah. And the breaking of that glass at the end of the wedding is a custom that is still followed at Jewish weddings today to commemorate the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. Even at the Jewish people's moments of greatest joy, they remember the destruction of the holiest site for the Jewish people. Rush concludes his letter with the following comment, quote, during the whole of this new and curious scene, my mind was not idle. I was carried back to the ancient world and was led to contemplate the Passovers, the sacrifices, and the jubilees of the Jewish people. Nearly 238 years ago, the founder of this college was moved to reflect on the history of the Jewish people after witnessing a Jewish wedding. The Jews at that wedding in America in 1787 demonstrated their connection to the Jewish people around the world, prayed for the ingathering of the exiles and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and broke a glass to commemorate in commemoration of the destruction of the Jewish temple. Compare and contrast Russia's deeply positive reaction to the expression of Jewish pride at the wedding with the alarming reaction we frequently see today when Jews take pride in their ancestral heritage. Today, Jews who define their identity as part of a people with a shared history and heritage rooted in the land of Israel are often demonized as, quote, Zionists, close quote, treated as pariahs and told that they are not welcome. It's no secret that anti-Semitism in the US is spiking. According to the FBI's hate crime report, between 2022 and 2023, single-bias anti-Jewish hate crimes increased 63%. In 2023, 68% of all reported religion-based hate crimes in the United States were targeting Jews. Think about that for a minute. Jews constitute only 2% of the US population, and yet in 2023, 68% of all religion-based hate crimes targeted Jews. In January 2024, the ADL reported that the first 3 months after October 7, 2023, so from October to January, the amount of anti-Semitism in those 3 months alone eclipsed the total number of anti-Semitic incidents from the prior 12 months combined. According to the ADL, in just those 3 months, anti-Semitic incidents increased 361%. Campuses are not immune from this anti-Semitism. Hillel International reported that between 2022 and 2023, anti-Semitic incidents on campus targeting Jewish students increased by 700%. And an ADL report issued last month, in February 2025, found that a whopping 83% of Jewish college students had either experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism since October 7, 2023. The American Jewish Committee, the AJC, also released its State of Anti-Semitism in America report last month. And according to that report, 56% of American Jews say that they have changed their behavior to avoid anti-Semitism. That includes not wearing or displaying Jewish symbols, not posting Judaism-related content online, and staying away from specific places, events, and situations. This number has been steadily rising. So in 2022, the number was 38%. In 2023, it was 46%, and now we are at 56%. 34% of Jewish students in the AJC survey said that they had changed their behavior to hide their Jewish identity. So they'd avoided wearing or carrying or displaying things that would identify them as Jewish. That's up from last year was 25%, so increased from 25 to 34%. 43% of students said that they would not express their opinions on Israel in the classroom or on campus. That's up from 26% the year before. 22% of students reported feeling or being excluded from a group event because they were Jewish. That was up from 20%. 2 years ago, it was 12%. And out of that 22%, more than half said they'd been excluded more than once. And finally, according to the AJC report, 81% of Jews say that caring about Israel is an important part of what being Jewish means to them. So what can we do to address this anti-Semitism? How can we reverse the tide? Well, first, we need to have a better understanding of how anti-Semitism works. And second, we need to have a better understanding of Jewish identity. So let's start with how anti-Semitism works. Anti-Semitism may be called society's oldest hatred, but it's one of the most difficult to recognize. And that's because anti-Semitism morphs. It looks different in every generation. The one constant about anti-Semitism is that no matter the century, Jews are always the scapegoat. Whatever society views as its misfortune, the Jews are to blame. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, so the allegations against Jews can appear diametrically opposed. That's how the Jew can be accused of being both the communist and the capitalist, the globalist and the isolationist, condemned for being stateless, and now for having a state. The Nazis, who sought a pure Aryan race, accused the Jews of being the ultimate race polluters. To the Nazis, the Jews were not white. Today, however, there are those who view the world through the binary lens of oppressed and oppressor. Anti-Semitism dictates that Jews will always be lumped into the evil category. So now there are those who say that all Jews, no matter their background or their skin color, are white colonizing oppressors. Anti-Semites who believe that the Jews are the cause of their misfortune believe the world would be a better place without the Jews. So anti-Semitism often seeks to other the Jew, to treat the Jew as unacceptable company. Think about the yellow Star of David that the Nazis had the Jews wear. Those wearing that star were to be shunned and excluded. Today, in addition to individual Jews living around the world, we have a Jewish collective, the Jewish nation-state of Israel, where more than half of the Jews in the world reside. And what we see today is that Israel is often treated as the collective Jew and labeled the villain. For example, there are those who accuse the Jewish state of being the world's worst violator of human rights, while being stunningly indifferent to the human rights abuses of countries such as North Korea, Iran, and China. Irwin Cutler, an internationally renowned human rights lawyer, former Justice Minister of Canada, and the first Canadian Special Envoy to monitor anti-Semitism, he once summed it up this way. He said, "If traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society, today's newer form of anti-Semitism seeks to do the same to the Jewish collective. It seeks to deny Israel its place in the society of nations. No other country is told it has no right to exist." That is contemporary anti-Semitism, and yet many people still don't recognize it as such. To effectively address anti-Semitism, we also need to understand Jewish identity. Judaism is an ethno-religion, a belief system inextricably connected to cultural heritage, traditions, history, and land. The connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel permeates the Jewish calendar, Jewish life cycle events, Jewish law, Jewish prayer, and Jewish history. For centuries, Jews have not only prayed facing Jerusalem, they have prayed to return to Jerusalem. L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, is heard each year at the Passover Seder and again at the conclusion of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Did you know that over half of the 613 commandments in the Pentateuch are connected to the land of Israel and can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel? But not all Jews are religiously observant. So what does it mean to be part of the Jewish people if you're not defining your Jewish identity according to religious belief or Jewish religious practice? Well, to be part of the Jewish people means that you believe that you belong to a people with an ancient heritage, a shared collective memory of the ancient story. That story we tell at the Passover Seder of the liberation of the Jewish people from slavery, well, as part of the Jewish people, those were my ancestors. That story that we tell at Hanukkah of the Maccabees that saved the Jewish people, those were my ancestors too. It's not possible to separate the ancestral history and heritage of the Jewish people from the land of Israel. The land of Israel is where the identity of the Jewish people was cemented. It's where the Jews lived as a people with a king, a code of laws, and a temple. Today, to be a Zionist means you recognize and celebrate the Jewish people's connection to one another and the Jewish people's deep-rooted tie to the land of Israel. It means you believe that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in some borders in their ancestral homeland. To be a Zionist does not mean that you have no criticism of Israel's policies. You can criticize the Israeli government and still be a Zionist. At this point, I should also make clear that not all Jews are Zionists, just as not all Jews are Sabbath observers. Jews define their identity in many different ways. The existence of Jews who do not observe the Sabbath, however, does not change the fact that if you were to ask a Jew who incorporates some level of Sabbath observance into their life, and there's a very wide spectrum of what they might be, but if you ask them why they do it, they would tell you that that Sabbath observance is a core component of what it means to them to be Jewish. Similarly, the fact that some Jews don't define their identity as including Zionism does not negate the fact that for most Jews, recognition of the Jews' history as a people indigenous to the land of Israel is an integral component of how they define their Jewish identity. One does not have to be a Sabbath observer to recognize discrimination of a Sabbath observer. Similarly, one does not have to be a Zionist to recognize discrimination of Zionists. To demand that a Jew shed their Zionism as the price of admission is comparable to demanding that a Catholic disavow the Vatican or a Muslim shed their connection to Mecca. It's discriminatory, biased, and immoral. And yet today on campuses and beyond, the vilification, demonization, and shunning of Zionists is becoming normalized. What is worse is that at the same time, the Jewish people's identity as a people and the Jewish people's history in the land of Israel is being erased and denied. There's now a term for this. It's called erasive antisemitism. Take, for example, a zine that was circulated by Students for Justice in Palestine last semester at Boston University. Under the title, "What is Zionism?" it says, and I quote, "We do not accept the term Jewish people in any form whatsoever." And then it goes on to say, quote, "For us, there is only one Jew, like all Jews know there is only one God," capitalized, "and that is a religious Jew," close quote. Since when does SJP have the right to define Jewish identity? Since when is it acceptable to tell Jews that they must disavow their people's history and heritage and define themselves as only a religion? Believe it or not, this is not a new phenomenon. It has happened before. In Europe, when Jews were offered emancipation and equal rights for the first time, in 1789, when the French National Assembly debated whether the French Declaration of the Rights of Man should apply to the Jews, Count Clermont-Tonnerre said, quote, "The Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals." The Jews of France were told that if they did not abandon their sense of Jewish peoplehood and pledge allegiance only to France, they would be expelled. With a choice like that, many Jews complied. They announced, "France is our Zion." The situation was repeated 7 years later in 1796 before the Dutch Parliament. There they debated the question of how could they give Dutch citizenship to a Jew if he felt connected to Jews in England, France, or Germany. One of the Dutch parliamentarians proposed that the Jews take an oath that began, quote, "I so-and-so declare that I do not belong to any other people nor any part of a people, but solely and only to the people of the Netherlands." Accusing Jews of dual loyalty is another ancient anti-Semitic trope. Jews throughout time have proven over and over again to be patriotic, loyal citizens of the countries in which they live, while still celebrating their Jewish heritage. Indeed, the child of the couple whose wedding Benjamin Rush attended proves just that point. The son of Rachel Phillips and Michael Levy was the American naval hero Uriah Levy. Uriah Levy was a U.S. Navy Commodore and the first Jewish person to hold that rank. He admired Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers' ideals of religious liberty. So in 1834, Uriah Levy purchased Thomas Jefferson's estate at Monticello, which had fallen into a state of disrepair. Uriah Levy spent his own money to restore and preserve Monticello. He buried his mother there and then bequeathed the estate to the American people. That is how the couple that Rush saw standing under the Jewish marriage canopy 238 years ago helped preserve an important piece of American history for future generations. So my challenge to you today is to respond to difference the way that the founder of Dickinson College, Benjamin Rush, responded to difference when he was invited to his first Jewish wedding. Embrace the difference with curiosity and positive enthusiasm. Learn not only about each other's customs, traditions, history, and heritage, but spend some time learning more about your own. Don't shun, silence, and exclude others. Instead, listen, share, and engage. Be proud of who you are without putting other people down. Because if you are able to do that, you will create a community here that is truly a safe, welcoming space for all, and you will be able to build together the better society that our country so desperately needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyza. So I'm Andrea Lieber. I'm the Sophia Ava Asbel Chair of Judaic Studies here at Dickinson and Professor of Religion. And I know that there is probably a really rich conversation to be had in this room. And I just want to kick it off by asking a question of my own, call it or the organizer's privilege. I want to just begin by thanking you for your words. I know that many of us here have heard things that we agree with, that we disagree with, and let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. I've been at Dickinson for 27 years, I think, something like that, and I'm so proud of this institution and the kinds of conversations that we're able to have. And so thank you for joining us today and inspiring us to talk. So I want to kind of go first to a question that is challenging for me personally as the sort of face of Jewish studies on this campus. There are some who argue that accusations of anti-Semitism are today being weaponized to curtail free speech or to curtail academic freedom. You wouldn't have any reason to know this, but last year, maybe it was this year, who can keep track of time, the faculty, some faculty group got together and passed a resolution at the faculty meeting in support of reaffirming the college's commitment to academic freedom. And so I want to know, what's your perspective on this claim, this issue of the potential weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence discourse, academic discourse, and how can we strike a balance between combating anti-Semitism, which is so important, and protecting free expression?
So thank you. I think your question really kind of cuts right to the key issue, because I think I'm a firm believer in free speech. I do think that we need to be able to engage in the dialogue and in the conversations. I'm not looking to silence anyone's speech. I think the challenge, perhaps the greatest challenge that we have today, is being able to distinguish between what is a good faith political debate and what is the vilification or dehumanizing of Jews. And the idea and the goal should be, let's have those conversations about the issues, but let's not dehumanize the people. And that's the problem, and that's what I was trying to address in my remarks, was to be able to say, you can criticize Israel. You can criticize the policies of the government of Israel. You do not have to be a Zionist, right? That's, but what you do and shouldn't be doing is vilifying anybody on the basis of how they define their identity, and recognizing that the Jews are not just a faith, but that Jews are also a people, and that our history and our heritage is inextricably linked to Israel. Understanding that so that we can have the conversations, right? Have the conversations about the issues, but don't say death to the Zionists. Don't say a Zionist is not welcome on my campus. Suggesting that you shouldn't be excluding the Zionists is not silencing anyone's speech. It's saying, let's honestly, genuinely be inclusive, right? That's the challenge. And over again, what I hear, and I hear from students who contact us, it's that there are spaces on campus now that are becoming off limits to Israelis and Zionists, where it's become explicit. It's no longer even hidden. And that's the problem. That's not silencing speech. That's trying to make sure that a community on campus is not discriminated against.
And how does, if I could just build on that, how does the work of the Brandeis Center, and specifically the work that you have been doing in upholding Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, what is that work about? Can you tell us a little bit about the role of Title VI and specifically, how it figures into this conversation?
Yes, I have various different materials that I carry with me. So a little primer on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to any entity that receives federal government funding. And the idea is that if you're going to receive the federal funds, they come with strings attached. And those strings are that you have to assure the government that whatever opportunities you're providing are provided in a non-discriminatory fashion, right? Nobody should be denied equal access to the opportunities you provide. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says, quote, "No person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." When it comes to institutions of higher education, almost all the institutions of higher education in the United States receive some kind of federal funding. Very small number that are purely privately funded. So Title VI would apply to private institutions as well as public. But it's a curious law, right, to use to protect members of faith-based communities. Because if you listen carefully, you heard that we talked about the grounds of race, color, or national origin, but religion's not included as a protected category. This became an issue particularly after 9/11, in the early 2000s, when Muslim students were being harassed and discriminated against, and Sikh students who were being mistaken for Muslims were suffering horrible bullying in some of the educational centers. And so when you have a potential violation of Title VI, what you can do is you can go one of two ways. You can either hire a lawyer, go to federal court, file a federal lawsuit, or what is more common is people will file an administrative complaint with the agency that's provided the funding. So for educational institutions, that is the Department of Education. And so in the early 2000s, when these complaints started coming into the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, the question arose as to whether or not it was even covered by Title VI, because these were faith-based groups. And the attorney who later went on to found the Brandeis Center, which is the nonprofit that I now lead, he was the acting assistant secretary for civil rights in the Department of Education at that point. And he said no. He said, if these members of the faith-based communities are being targeted on the basis of one of these other categories, race, color, national origin, that are part of Title VI, they don't lose that protection just because they also share a common faith. And he set out this understanding in 2004, so it's now 20 years, more than 20 years, that there has been this understanding that members of faith-based communities are covered by Title VI when they're targeted on the basis of what's now called their shared ancestry and ethnicity. And so the way Title VI has been used and the way we at the Brandeis Center have provided support and assistance to students is that when there are students who are feeling that they're being denied that equal access, they're being denied that equal educational opportunity because they're being told, you're a Zionist, you can't participate here. Well, what is their Zionism? Their Zionism, as I've described, nobody's asking them, nobody's interviewing them about what their political opinion or their viewpoint is, right? When we've had encampments and Jewish students were excluded, they weren't interviewed or asked, well, what's your position on a two-state solution, or what do you think about Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu? What would happen is they would be seen wearing a Star of David necklace, or they might be overheard speaking Hebrew, and that was enough to brand them a Zionist and say, well, you're not welcome. And so that didn't have anything to do with their political opinions or their viewpoints. It had everything to do with the fact that, oh, those must have been one of those Jews who view themselves maybe as part of a people, somehow connected to Israel. And that's what we have argued, and successfully, that is part of the Jews' shared ancestral and ethnic heritage, and to exclude someone on that basis is a form of discrimination that could put you in violation of Title VI.
Thank you. I think it's time to open up for questions. I have about 30 more that I could ask on my own. Ryan and Lilith, if you guys would come. Actually, I think you can take one person can take my microphone, and Ted has one over there. And we have another one. Great. Are there people who'd like to ask questions? Just raise your hand. And, again, I'd just like to request that everyone ask with the intention and the spirit of inquiry.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's clear that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Where do you see the future of anti-Semitism going? And more specifically and selfishly, I have a 10-year-old, so in 8 years, should I continue to fund my 529 as a Zionist or as a Jew, or go somewhere else?
So I'm always the cautious optimist, but I do think that there is a growing understanding of both anti-Semitism and Jewish identity. And I think we see it because there have been, in the past half a year even, several schools that have actually taken steps to articulate and make clear that they recognize and understand that for many students, Zionism is an integral part of their Jewish identity. So you have, for example, at the University of Illinois, at Urbana-Champaign, they, several months ago, actually settled a complaint that had been filed with the Office for Civil Rights. And in that settlement, they reaffirmed what they called a joint statement that had been made initially years ago when they were kind of starting this process. And that joint statement said, and I quote, "For many Jewish students, Zionism is an integral part of their identity and their ethnic and ancestral heritage. These students have the right to openly express identification with Israel. The university will safeguard the abilities of these students, as well as all students, to participate in university-sponsored activities free from discrimination and harassment." Goes on, it says, "We deplore anti-Semitic incidents on campus, including those that demonize or delegitimize Jewish and pro-Israel students or compare them to Nazis. This subjects them to double standards that are not applied to others. All Jewish students, including those who identify with Israel or Jewish campus organizations, should be able to participate in campus activities aimed at fighting racism and achieving social justice." There's also, more recently, both NYU and Harvard have made clear that they will view as potential violations of their anti-discrimination policies when Zionist is just substituted basically for Jew. So NYU and Harvard have issued language like this. This is the NYU language, but Harvard's is pretty much identical, which is using code words like Zionist does not eliminate the possibility that your speech violates their anti-discrimination policy. For many Jewish people, Zionism is a part of their Jewish identity. Speech and conduct that would violate the anti-discrimination policy if targeting Jewish or Israeli people can also violate the policy if directed towards Zionists. For example, excluding Zionists from an open event, calling for the death of Zionists, applying a quote-unquote no Zionist litmus test for participation in any activity, school activity, using or disseminating tropes, stereotypes, and conspiracies about Zionists, e.g. Zionists control the media, demanding a person who is or is perceived to be Jewish or Israeli to state a position on Israel or Zionism, or minimizing or denying the Holocaust or invoking Holocaust imagery or symbols to harass or discriminate. So my point is just that I do think we're starting to see universities recognize this and try and take steps to protect the Jewish students. So my hope is that by the time your 10-year-old reaches and is applying to college, the situations will have improved. I definitely think we should keep going to schools.
There are some student questions. Let's prioritize the students for now.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is to you as both an attorney and the leader of the Brandeis Center. What can I do as a student when I'm starting to see a space become discriminatory or starting to hear some discriminatory rhetoric, especially if it's in some kind of club or organization I'm part of?
So you can reach out to the Brandeis Center. That's the first thing you can do. The easy way is just even send an email to info@brandeiscenter.com. But that's what we're here for. And there are organizations like the Brandeis Center, but what we would do in that situation is if you reached out to us, we would talk to you to hear more about what it is that you're experiencing, and then try to help you navigate it initially to see if it's possible to address it and have the university address it. You know, that's the initial hope, right? Is that once the university recognizes that you're actually getting pushed out of a space on the basis of your Jewishness, that they'll take the steps to try and protect and make sure that that doesn't happen. Some schools, unfortunately, not like this one, I should say, but some schools, unfortunately, it's sometimes more frustrating. But if you reach out to us, we'll try and help you navigate those situations.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I was wondering, how can we celebrate and recognize the historical significance of Israel for the Jewish people without endorsing the apartheid of other groups in the region that are also indigenous to the area?
Say it again. How can we repeat the question?
Celebrate and recognize the historical significance of Israel for the Jewish people without endorsing the apartheid of other groups that are indigenous to the area?
I think it's quite possible to do that. I mean, the truth is, if you're seeking coexistence, I actually think that there are two models in the region. I think that you can look at the countries that signed on to the Abraham Accords, the UAE, right, Morocco, and you can say, which is what they said, we want coexistence, and for coexistence, we need to engage more. We need, more economic trade, more people engaging. And then there's another perspective, which is no, we should engage in boycott. We should not have any kind of communications. Anti-normalization is what they used to call it. And if you take a look and you see who are the entities that are promoting the boycott and the non-engagement, they are the groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran that have made no secret of the fact that their goal is not peace and coexistence. Their goal is to eradicate the one and only Jewish state of Israel. And so then you have a choice. right? You can either decide, I want to get to peace and coexistence, and the model that I prefer to follow is increased engagement, economic engagement, and personal engagement, or there's the other one. I prefer the path that seems to be the path to peace and coexistence through engagement.
Hi, thank you very much. Is the term anti-Semitism an archaic term? Why are we still using it? And in terms of the context of using the word anti-Zionism, is that, in your opinion, pretty much the same thing? Because the identity of the Jewish individual is completely lost in both of them. So I wondered if you could just kind of parse that a little bit.
Some people prefer the term Jew hatred. I think it's much clearer. I recognize that we have these terms that have been around for a long time, so to just suggest that we're abandoning them, and I definitely don't think that we should abandon the term Zionism. I think we need to reclaim the term Zionism. But whether anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism are terms that people even really understand, I think you're right, that there are many people in the world who don't really understand them. So to the extent you can describe anti-Semitism as Jew hatred, I agree with you. But I also, and it's the term I mentioned, I do think that if we're using the term anti-Semitism, the idea of erasive anti-Semitism is something that now folks should be recognizing as kind of maybe one of the newer forms of trying to demonstrate this hostility towards Jews. Because what it really is doing is, as we are gaining traction in terms of making it clear that the law protects Jews not only on the basis of discrimination that targets us on the basis of our religious beliefs or religious practice, but the law also protects us when we're being targeted on the basis of our shared ancestry and ethnicity. What's happening now is those who want to engage in Jew hatred are often saying, oh no, you don't even have a shared ancestry and ethnicity. You're not a people, and you don't have a history here. You're only a religion. Well, that is, I think, a form of Jew hatred by erasing and denying how I define my Jewish history and heritage.
Thank
you. Hi, sorry. I'm going to give some context to my question because I just want you to know that it's coming from experience research I've collected, just kind of as a student curious about academia and what you've pursued. I also wanted to thank you for the initial anecdote about the Rush letter and the culture of Jewish weddings. I've been really grateful to be in communities that have welcomed me into different Jewish practices, and actually, the encampment at this school is how I met a lot of, or got closer to a lot of my Jewish friends who've kind of allowed me to understand parts of their circles and where they come from. This goes into my question of how exactly you use your title as a human rights lawyer to enforce human rights recognition in both portions when you're talking specifically about your fighting anti-Semitism as well as the justice for all that was quoted earlier, considering that the UNUDHR definition of ethnic cleansing and attempting genocide has been confirmed as set upon the Palestinian people today. Obviously, considering hate crimes as a whole are not recognized by the ADL, who actually has contributed to the Canary Mission. I don't know if you've heard of them, but their articles which defame the Council on American Islamic Relations. Would you suggest that there should be more of an expanse of researchers from different religious backgrounds in different fields to be able to collect more general knowledge on the way to approach the, I'm just going to say the issue because, you've talked about a lot. I noticed your talk today was majority derived from your summer 2023 article in Sapir, sorry if I mispronounced that, where I do recognize opinion is welcome as it was of your own personal writing and not of the law. But I guess to wrap it up, what do you say about the contested data collection as well by the ADL, who's a primary source,
from yours and other writers on that side as well, on these matters in particular? And who else do you recommend I look at or reach to in terms of academia? And then lastly, points on legal definitions that you see are contested.
So there's a lot in your question.
I know.
So, so I think, and correct me if I'm not fully, I think what you're trying to suggest is that data that I've relied upon might be contested. That's right. And that claims like for genocide or apartheid are not contested? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, they're contested by several communities, but what I'm saying is your title is a human rights lawyer, right? Your specialty is in human rights law.
Mm-hmm.
There have been charters that have specifically defined those types of events and war crimes, et cetera, and they've been followed and applied. Specifically, that's not something that you can necessarily contest if you look at the UN charters that are written down and where they've derived from, which have been from Jewish leaders and more, and how that incorporates into that.
So I think that to answer your question, as a human rights lawyer, I fully believe that in human rights for everyone, right? I fully believe that when there are people who are being harassed or discriminated against, whatever their identity, the law should be used to protect them. I do think that some of the sources that you might be suggesting are uncontested are contested, right? I don't collect the ADL data, but I do talk almost every day to students. So I know from just the personal anecdotes that I've been hearing about the shunning and the exclusion of the Zionists on campus. But at the same time, I will say, if there are Muslims that are experiencing harassment and discrimination, the law should apply to them, right? And they should be protected too. I fully believe that. You know, what I said before, let's talk about the issues and the ideas, but let's not dehumanize anybody.
Yeah, of course. Do you mind if I ask one follow-up? The definitions of anti-Semitism that you've referenced and have been circulated in your work and around your sphere have been the ones that included boycotting as well as being openly, publicly pro-Palestine, as people call it, and lastly, as outwardly criticizing Israel to certain people. Is that something that you think needs further dialogue?
So you're asking specifically about definitions of anti-Semitism?
Yes, that's the one that you've applied.
Right. So I support the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. I think that's the IHRA. So first of all, there have been over decades, if not centuries, I mean, as long as you've had the term anti-Semitism, people who have tried to define it, different scholars. But what makes the IHRA definition unique is that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is an intergovernmental body. So you actually had government representatives at the time in 2016 from over 31 countries, now there are over 40, but who were members, who all had to agree unanimously on this language because they recognized that in order to be able to combat anti-Semitism, you have to be able to have a common understanding of what it is. And the thing about the IHRA definition, and I often recommend that when people want to understand the IHRA definition, the best way to do that is to actually, IHRA issued their definition in 2016. In 2010, the United States was the first time that the State Department adopted a definition of anti-Semitism, was in 2010 in the Obama administration. And they issued this definition based on what was the precursor to the IHRA definition. And if you Google State Department definition of anti-Semitism, in the intro, now they use the IHRA definition, but if you, in the intro language, you can find the link to the 2010 definition. And if you go to it, you'll see Read it side by side with IRA, because it has a definition followed by examples, which is just the way the IRA definition does it. The main difference, the definition language itself is identical, and the language of the examples is almost word for word identical. The big difference is that in 2010, they pulled out the examples relative to Israel. This is a nice PDF of it with the little State Department symbol, but they put the examples relative to Israel on the second page under a heading that says, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? Which is exactly what the question is that we're still dealing with today. And then they divided up the examples into 3 subheadings, which are demonize Israel, double standard for Israel, and delegitimize Israel. And if you read the examples, you'll begin to understand what those 3, some people might recognize those are what are called Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, because Natan Sharansky was a Soviet refusenik, spent 9 years, most of them in solitary confinement in the Soviet Gulag until he was allowed to emigrate to Israel, became a member of the Israeli parliament, became the head of the Jewish agency. He tried to articulate, how do we know when the criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism? Not because we want to silence it, and not because we want to punish it, right? In fact, both the 2010 definition and the IRA definition explicitly say, and it's got here language that says, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. The point is just to be able to label it. This is a definition, right? We want to be able to understand, how do we see it? How does anti-Semitism manifest? Right? What does it mean? How do we tell the difference between that vilification of Jews and that political debate? And so what they say is, one is demonize Israel. Demonize is if you envision that anti-Semitic caricature of the hook-nosed, conniving, bloodthirsty Jew. But instead of it being applied to individual Jews, it's now applied to Israel as the Jewish collective. Israel is conniving and bloodthirsty. That's not a discussion about specific Israeli policy. That's just demonizing the Jewish collective. That's demonization. Double standard is when you hold Israel to a higher standard than you hold any other country. It's like what you see at the United Nations, where you have more resolutions condemning Israel than you have against any other countries, all the other countries combined. Right? And then delegitimize Israel. In 2010, it was defined here, the example was denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination and denying Israel the right to exist. In the IRA definition, that was changed to denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by calling Israel a racist endeavor. Well, if you think about it, why is that crossing the line into anti-Semitism? Because if the Jewish people's right to self-determination in some borders, right? We can debate what the borders are, but if the right to self-determination comes from the idea that the Jews are not just a faith, they're a people, and they're a people with an ancestral connection to this land, then if you're going to say Israel has no right to exist, what you're really doing is saying, no, you're not a people, and you have no history in this land. That's what it means to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, and that's why it's crossing the line into anti-Semitism. But that's how you understand these definitions, and that's why I suggest you, if you read this, you'll better understand the IRA definition as well.
Can I just, do you recognize the fact that every point that you just made has also been contested?
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that there are people who don't like the IRA definition. Yes, I agree. Right, that won't accept it. Right, that don't agree. I accept that. I accept that.
Hi, just want to say, firstly, thank you for all your father's work and your work as well on a personal level. And this last increase in anti-Semitism it comes from a very different perspective. Usually, at least what I've experienced traveling across the country, is that anti-Semitism usually comes from the least educated and lowest, the lowest classes in society tend to be hateful. And what we're seeing is that this anti-Semitism is coming from the most educated and is growing out of our education system that's supposed to be teaching us to be good and moral people. So when you're doing your work, how much are you able to get to the root causes that are causing institutions of education to become institutions that are creating this system of thinking that results in a lot of hatred and a lack of understanding to other perspectives.
I feel like we need to be asking the administrators how to address that challenge. It's a challenge, right? I think that, one of the reasons why I think anti-Semitism spreads in a society is when the society is not healthy, right? Because people want to be able to blame somebody, something for what's not going right. And I do think that we have had, in general, an unhealthy society. And the Jews, as I said, become the scapegoat. It is very challenging to see on the university campuses what's happened, because I do think that students today very much want to be able to be engaged in making a positive difference in this world. And I think that there is a core group, and oftentimes it's not always coming from students on the campus. Sometimes it's initiated from outside the campus, finding some support on the campus. And that what happens is you have a core group that may really be looking to blame, that may be engaged in the Jew hatred, but then you have a larger group that joins in that doesn't know enough to be able to challenge the narrative and actually believes some of the distorted history, right? When I say, I think about how when Yasser Arafat told Bill Clinton there was no Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, Bill Clinton writes about in his book how he couldn't believe it. He said, "Are you kidding me? Every kid who goes to Sunday school knows that there was a Jewish temple there." And yet today there are a whole generation, certainly in that part of the world, that have grown up believing there was no Jewish temple on the Temple Mount. And so we do have to respond to that challenge, because there are spaces on campus that I think are not pushing back hard enough to try and make sure that students have full access to all the different perspectives. I mean, one of the things I see now on campuses a lot is that when it comes to Israel, for example, you can have a constant beat of the anti-Israel speakers who come in, who are condemning, but where do you allow the other perspective to be heard, right? Where are the people who are permitted to come and speak and share the different perspective? So you're right, it's a challenge, and it's scary to see it happening in higher education, but I do think that, again, I'm cautiously optimistic, because I think universities are starting to recognize it, and they're starting to recognize that some of the people who are causing the disruption are really just in it for the sake of disruption. Like when there are groups on campuses that have just vandalized property for the sake of, obstruction and vandalizing, I think the universities have realized that's blocking us from being able to do what is our mission, to teach. So I'm like I say, hopeful that administrators will be able to help turn this around.
I have two questions about Deborah Lipstadt. She has stepped down from her position at the State Department. There are several individuals that have been mentioned as possible successors, if indeed there is a successor, Alan Dershowitz, among others. Can you compare and contrast some of those? And you don't want to. And as far as her, she declined to go to Columbia University. I guess she's going to go back to Emory. Wouldn't it be the best place for her right now? Doesn't Columbia need her as much as anywhere?
So as far as the folks, I don't know. I just hope that whoever it is who comes in is able to address anti-Semitism from all the extremes, that they recognize the anti-Semitism from the right, that they recognize the anti-Semitism from the left, that the Islamic fundamentalism, and that they are able to address all of it, and that they recognize erasive anti-Semitism. Deborah Lipstadt, I mean, I think I saw her piece. You know, she seemed to be saying that I think she was afraid that she would be put out there as, well, we've solved the problem, we brought Deborah Lipstadt, and that's not enough. And I think that she wanted to be sure that if you had students who were disrupting, who were breaking the rules, they'd be held accountable, and she hadn't felt that she'd seen that. Now, of course, I heard news today that they suspended or expelled a couple more students. Maybe she'll change her mind, I don't know. But that's what I think. So, yes, I mean, I like I've said before, I don't think we should be abandoning the universities, but she's entitled to make her own decisions.
Hello. So I had a question specifically surrounding student encampments and student protests, specifically about the, when a protest or an encampment becomes physically destructive or violent, of course that is completely unacceptable. But in the context of like emotions, it is understandable that the comfortability of students on campus is extremely important, especially when it comes to the religious or ethnic identity. But why is it acceptable to prioritize the emotional comfort of one religious or ethnic group on campus over another in terms of why is it acceptable to tell a certain group of students to stop protesting over something that they think is important to bring to attention?
I wouldn't tell a group to stop protesting. I think that a school has a right to set their time, place, and manner restrictions. They have a right to say, here's where the demonstrations can be during these hours. They can't be so loud that, I've had schools where students would say, we can't even hear the teacher in the classroom because the demonstration is so loud in the vestibule or, right outside the classrooms. So the school has the right to set time, place, and manner restrictions for the demonstration, and as long as the students are abiding by that, they should be able to have their demonstration. The problem is when it goes beyond that. In other words, when they're blocking access to certain buildings and not allowing certain people through, or when they're actually, we've had stories, and I've talked to students who, they'll say, well, I can't walk past because folks from the encampment will trail me, or they'll encircle me, or they'll get in my face in my private, personal space and trying to intimidate me. That's different. That's not speech anymore, right? That's more threatening and intimidating and harassment. So that's where I would say, okay, set the rules and stick by the rules. But if you stick by the rules, yes, you can demonstrate. Nobody's emotional, right? We're not picking one over the other. Now, at the same time, right, I do think that to have a conversation, right, about if those kinds of things are happening, right, if there is the creation of an atmosphere on campus that is vilifying a community and trying to turn the campus against part of the university community, that should be called out, right? So in other words, if you have an encampment that is saying death to the Zionists, Zionists aren't welcome, and is trying to teach the campus community that the culture should be to shun and exclude Zionists, then even if you're abiding by the time, place, and manner restrictions, there needs to be a conversation about why we shouldn't be doing that for any part of our community, right? We shouldn't be trying to turn our community against anybody who's here. So that conversation needs to be had.
I just want to ask a clarifying question about that, because we have campus demonstration policies on this campus that were created following our own encampment. And from my experience of this encampment, I don't believe that any of those things happened. We weren't blocking access to anything. Nothing was happening in which we tried very hard to make sure that people felt like they were able to come up to us and ask questions. We weren't following anyone. So I was just wondering, do your definitions of this extend to, it seems that even with peaceful protests that are meant as a space for discussion and open learning between communities, there still seems to be a hierarchy of oppression, almost, of who gets to be the one who says, well, this is emotionally damaging for me and my identity. And why on campuses does it get to be that one community is prioritized in the hate against them versus another community who is also feeling like there is hate happening against them?
I guess it's challenging for me to answer it, not really knowing all the details of what happened here. But if you can get to the point of actually engaging in a respectful dialogue, great. If, on the other hand, what is happening is not a conversation about issues, but it is, and this is, when I went to college, and I'm too old, right? But when I went to college, we actually would have conversations about issues. And we could disagree passionately, but it wasn't a reflection on the person, right? In other words, it wasn't that if a person took a position, that person would then be called racist or bigoted or whatever it was. We have a disagreement about the issue. That seems to be harder and harder for the current student generation. And I see my kids, I talk to my kids about this, right? And I'm not sure, we have to work to get past that, right? Because I do think that conversation about the issue doesn't happen. What happens instead is the dehumanizing and the vilification of the person. And so if the sense was that the encampment was doing that to a community on campus, right? Then that's what I think the feeling was. That's unacceptable. We can't tolerate that. And I will say, I don't think, just in general from my experience talking to students, I see much, right? What I see is the death to the Zionists aren't welcome. I don't see mass encampments going the other way around. I don't see people trying, you may say that there's the hate, but I don't see people pushing out and excluding the folks who are holding the encampments, right? And so that's why I think what the universities are saying is, it's not prioritizing one over the other, it's saying, don't turn our campus against the Zionists. Don't turn them against the Jews who are saying what you're doing is not talking about the issues. I've seen Zionists who have over and over again said, let's talk about the issues, and what'll happen is they'll be told, oh no, we can't talk, anti-normalization, or oh no, I won't talk to the oppressor, right? And so then that actual political debate or dialogue or discussion about the issues or sharing of real, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, and instead, the Zionist just feels shunned and excluded.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I just have a quick question. If you could provide some resources or some ways to start the conversation about how to fight back against anti-Semitism, because sometimes it can be really intimidating to speak up, even to reach out to resources like the one that you work for. So if you can give some pointers to start talking to staff, to administration, to professors, to other students, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
You just said it, right? If there are folks on the campus, if there are administrators, if there is staff, if there are people who you can talk to. But what I would recommend is if what you're feeling, right, is this shunning on the basis of how you define your Jewishness, right? And this didn't start October 7th, right? I spoke to students for years, and I would listen to them, and they would share with me, right? We'd actually talk about, what is your Jewish identity, right? Where does it come from? Because so many students who I would talk to who were on the front lines were not defining their Jewish identity by religious belief or religious practice. Most of them, right, they did not observe the Sabbath, didn't keep a kosher diet. And I would ask them, so what's happening? And their feeling was they wanted to engage outside the Jewish bubble the way they'd always engaged their whole lives. And now they were coming to campus, and it seemed as if somebody was saying to them, well, what kind of Jew are you? And if that's what's happening to you, then you need to talk about it that way. Because the administrators need to understand it that way. The people who you're engaging with need to understand it that way. You need to be saying, wait a minute, why are you asking me what kind of Jew am I? Right? If you want to talk about the issues, okay, we can try and create that environment to have those challenging conversations. But don't try and make me feel shame for some reason because I believe I'm part of a people and that the Jewish people have this ancestral connection to the land of Israel, right? I'm entitled to take pride in my ancestral heritage. And I'm entitled to engage fully in all these opportunities on campus with that part of my identity. I shouldn't have to hide it. I shouldn't have to feel bad about it. That's the way that I would suggest having the conversation, because that's the first conversation that needs to be had. There needs to be that understanding before you can get to then have a respectful dialogue, if they're ready to have a respectful dialogue about the actual political debate and the issue.
Alyza, would you say likewise for students who are maybe Jewish but who don't feel that, right? That
Yes.
they shouldn't feel shame about not feeling the connection to their ancestral homeland or Jewish peoplehood in the same way?
Yes, I mean, I've said that when we were talking, I said, if you don't want to be a Zionist, you don't have to be a Zionist, right? I'm not trying to make people Zionists. And so I don't think anybody should be shamed, right? And I think if we can get right to the conversations on the issues, then let's have that respectful discussion. But nobody should be calling the other one names or trying to push the other one out or marginalize or isolate somebody.
Hi, thank you for speaking today. I'm Zoe. I'm Jewish. I also identify as an anti-Zionist Jew, and I helped to organize our encampment last semester, just for some context on who I am. I appreciate your most recent response in particular, because I was often shamed for holding those multiple identities by members of my Jewish community. But anyways, I want to return back to Professor Lieber's question about weaponizing anti-Semitism. It's weird to talk into a microphone, sorry. I have witnessed over the past year and a half a lot of politicians and other people in power using accusations of anti-Semitism to shut down any criticism of Israel, and accusing people of anti-Semitism in Senate congressional hearings and other similar circumstances, saying, oh, anybody who even voices support for Palestine, regardless of how they do it, is inherently anti-Semitic. And so I'm curious how you reconcile fighting anti-Semitism, which is a very important goal, with also making sure that other marginalized groups, especially Palestinian people are also able to articulate their own right to self-determination and fight discrimination against other people as well?
So personally, I use the IRA definition, right, to understand. And so in terms of understanding anti-Semitism, or I will look to those 3 Ds, right? I will say the criticism of Israel is legitimate when it's criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country. If it demonizes, applies a double standard, or delegitimizes Israel, then I do think it's anti-Semitic. I think in this country, you have a right to say all sorts of horrible things. You can say racist things, you can say bigoted things, you can say anti-Semitic things. That doesn't protect you from having those things being labeled as racist or bigoted or anti-Semitic. So that would be how I would define, right, the difference. And I do, as I said, I think Palestinian heritage, history, right, celebrate it, but don't feel the need to demonize my history and heritage in the process. Don't feel the need to erase mine in the process. In other words, right, there was, before October 7th, at the University of Pennsylvania, there was what they called the Palestine Rights Festival with a W, to celebrate, right, Palestinian literature and heritage. And I was curious, can you celebrate it without demonizing Jewish identity? And so I asked students, out of this 3-day conference, how many sessions, out of like 50 some odd sessions, don't mention Jews or Israelis or Zionists? And I think there were 2. I was like, why can't you celebrate Palestinian history and heritage without demonizing Jewish identity? That's the key, right?
I think we have time for maybe a couple more. Ava, you've had your hand up this entire time.
All right, so this question actually kind of goes a little bit away from college campuses and relates to the current political state of the United States. For example, like during the inauguration where Elon Musk did the Sieg Heil, and then the ADL said he wasn't anti-Semitic for that because he supported Israel. And I've noticed that kind of being a trend among right-wing politicians, and also with like the idea of Christian Zionism, which states that all Jews must go to Israel so that like Jesus can come back. So like, how do you kind of reconcile those things in dealing with that, where it'll be said it's not anti-Semitism because it's pro-Israel, despite the fact that it is very much anti-Semitic, like, you know, doing the Sieg Heil on stage?
Some of that, I think, gets into your question or somebody's question about politicizing, right, the anti-Semitism. I'm much more focused on the impact on people, right? And so, yeah, I do think that sometimes, you know, people jump to what they want to, they jump to use the term, and some politicians do it for political reasons. It's unfortunate. And yeah, it's challenging. I mean, sometimes there are situations where you have folks who you'll say, well, why did they just do that? Why did they just do that? And it seems inconsistent, right? Yeah. But I do think that at the end of the day, what I'm focused on is trying to make sure that Jews, right? We mentioned my father, and he spoke here 25 years ago. I grew up in a home where my father was using the law really to protect Jews, to make sure they could practice their faith in this country. And what I've come to realize is that if we only use the law to protect Jews on the basis of our religious beliefs and our religious practice, we're missing so much of the harassment and discrimination that Jews in the United States are experiencing today, which has nothing whatsoever to do with our religious beliefs and our religious practice, and everything to do with our identity as a people and our ancestral connection to the land of Israel. And so my real focus now is to make sure that our laws are protecting the Jews in this country, to make sure that we can do both, that we can practice our faith freely and with pride, and that we can celebrate our ancestral history and heritage and our identity as a people too. And that's the anti-Semitism that I focus on.
Thank you.
So I have two questions about legally protected speech and Zionism. One's rhetorical and one's actual. If fascism was essential to an ethnic group, as you suppose Zionism is to the Jewish people, would fascism be a protected belief? Now, I suppose the difference is that Zionism isn't an imminent threat to us as Nazism is, or sorry, fascism. Like Zionists have already achieved their initial goal while fascists haven't. But if we went back 100 years, then wouldn't Zionism be an imminent threat to native Palestinians? Because like, how can you have a nation state of Jewish people as Zionists want without displacing the native Palestinians?
So, I think that you've got a faulty premise there, which is that Zionism was never intended to ethnically cleanse Israel of the Palestinians. And one of the things that is interesting, if you want to understand the early Zionism, and that would be the political movement of Zionism, right? When I talk about Zionist as Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood, when Theodor Herzl came along in the late 1800s, he comes up with this idea that at its core is saying, well, the Jews are a people, and so if they're a people, they should be entitled to sovereignty, ultimately where? In their ancestral homeland. And then you have the political movement of Zionism, but at its core, the idea that the Jews are a people indigenous to the land of Israel is how Jews at that point define their identity. But one of the key leaders in the Zionist movement at the time was Chaim Weizmann, who ultimately became the first president of Israel when it was founded. And he spoke and gave a speech in 1937. Okay, so this is now before Israel was created. And he spoke at the 20th Zionist Congress. And I just want to read to you an excerpt, because if you want to understand what Zionism was at that time, well, the person who was a leader in the movement and ultimately became the president of the country is a good indicator. And he says the following, quote, "There is an Arab nation," actually, hold on, I'll go back a paragraph here. It goes, "Permit me at this historic juncture to say a word to the Arab people. We know that the Mufti of Jerusalem, that was Haj Amin al-Husseini, and then there was another Nazi collaborator whose name was Fawzi al-Kaukaji. He says, we know that they are not the Arab nation. In the present world, those who have bombs and revolvers at command wield political power, but in the history of a nation, their life is like one day, even if it extends over years. There is an Arab nation with a glorious past. To that nation we have stretched out our hand, and do so even now, but on one condition. Just as we wish them to overcome their crisis and to revert to the great tradition of a mighty and civilized Arab people, so must they know that we have the right to build our home in Eretz Yisrael, harming no one, helping all. When they acknowledge this, we shall reach common ground, and I hope for the time when we shall once more recognize each other. So the hope then, as the hope now, has always been for peace and coexistence. That's always been what the Zionists, right, then have looked for and have wanted. It's what the Israel population always has sought all these years.
Okay, I think we have, I just use your microphone. Obviously, this could go on for hours and hours. I just would like to wrap this up by saying thank you to everyone for your respect, for your goodwill in engaging in this conversation. I would like to thank all the people who made today possible. I would like to especially thank President Jones and your office for inviting Alyza to come to campus. Thank you, Renee, and the Office of Academic Affairs for your support. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Heather. Thank you to Rhonda and Ted Ebert, who have established a fund to support programming in Judaic Studies. Who am I forgetting? My colleagues in the Department of Religion and Judaic Studies. Thank you to everyone who showed up here, to our incredible students. I love this place because of evenings like this where we can have really good conversation. So with that, we're gonna close this program, but the conversation is not over. Let's keep talking. Thank you.